Greetings. My name is Michael Erlewine, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Tibetan prayer beads. I need to say I'm not an expert in this. I've kind of worked with the Tibetan community for maybe 40 years, and I know something about it. And I'm only doing this because some of you out there might need to know some of this stuff who know even less than I do, but I'm certainly not an expert. As far as beads, I grew up as a Catholic, and so Catholics have rosaries, and rosaries are like a string of 50 beads in 5, 10 bead sections, along with some extra beads and a cross. So anyway, I know beads pretty well. And in fact, most spiritual groups of all kinds have some kind of prayer beads that they use of one kind or another, but especially the Buddhists do. And these beads are used to keep track of, I mean, part of it's just, a mnemonic device, but mostly they're used to keep track of how many recitations. If you're doing mantras, how many mantras have you done? Now, Catholics call their beads a rosary. We know that, and so rosary is a pretty common term. But the Buddhists and the Hindus call their beads Mullahs, M-A-L-A. And it's after a Sanskrit word that means garland. And the recitation of mantras and prayers is called japa. Tibetan Mullahs tend to have 108 beads, plus one large bead that's called a guru bead. I've been to Tibet a couple of times, and I can tell you that every Tibetan has a mala, knows how to use it, and probably uses it. Or at least all the ones that I've ever met actually use their mala. They're very precious, very much a part of their culture. And they also have shorter malas, and especially the Hindu groups, wrist malas. There's just a few beads. And there's even such a thing in Hindu culture as a ring finger, not a ring finger, but a finger mala that is a silver ring with knobs that you just turn it on your hand. I don't think you can keep count that way, but it's just kind of a comforting way of using it as an object of meditating. Now, Tibetan malas are strung in a circle of string consisting of one large central bead. I mean, here is a mala. I think I'm going to show you. I'm not going to keep picking this up probably, but I'll show it to you in inserts here. But in any given mala, there's one central bead that's larger called a guru bead, and the rest are all subsidiary beads that work with that bead. So typically there's a guru bead and 108 smaller beads. And the smaller beads on a Tibetan mala can be, and often usually are, separated into 4 sections of 27 beads by inserting 3 marker beads, which brings the total to 112 beads. And then you have to add in the guru bead, and there may be a few other beads added on below the guru bead toward what's called the tassel. So anyway, just to go over the format with you, in case some of you want to write it down, it'd be crystal clear. There's the guru bead, there's 27 beads, 1 marker bead, 27 beads, 1 marker bead, 27 beads, 1 marker bead, 27 beads, and you're back to the guru bead again. Now, the marker beads, the 3 marker beads, which most Tibetans have these, and there's a certain amount of display in having really nice marker beads and stuff like that. But the marker bead that you want to have, the preferred choice, is red coral. And I'll show you some inserts of it, but there's a red coral in the middle of a bunch of beads, right? They just mark off the 27 bead sections, and they look nice. Now, the red coral the Tibetans use originally came from coral beds in the northern part of the Mediterranean, and they managed to get to Tibet via what's called the Silk Road. However, these beds are long gone. They dried up and died out I don't even know how long ago, but a very long time ago, so that these beads today are rare and expensive. Although literally every Tibetan that I've ever met has them, although they have some pretty good surrogates. They look like red coral, but it's not really red coral. So I have no idea. But if you wanted to give a Tibetan a present, giving them some authentic coral beads would be a heck of a present, wonderful present. Now, additionally, many Mullahs have 2 sets of silver counters that are added onto them that hang off the mala. And they're usually placed, but not always, after the 10th bead on either side of the guru bead. Now, these are additional counters to keep track of the rounds of mantras that are done. And at the end of each of these 2 sets of counters is usually a symbol. It can be copper, silver, whatever, but one small dorje or vajra, which is a typical Tibetan motif, and then the other side would have a small bell. Now, traditionally, one starts counting from the guru bead in the direction of the counters with the vajra. Now, there's another thing, that you count all the way around the mala, and when you get to the guru bead again, you don't just cross over the bead and keep counting. That's considered disrespectful. In fact, what you do is reverse. So if you hit the mala bead, if you're going along, and I don't know if I can show you this or not, but going along and I hit the mala bead, then we just turn around and start the other direction. So it's considered, crossing over the guru bead is considered to be impolite to the guru, a sign of disrespect, or possibly even harmful to the guru. Now remember that for most Tibetans, for many of us, the mala that we use the most is the mala that either our guru teacher has given us, or it's one that we've taken and had it blessed by the gurus themselves. So that you'll find a typical thing that Tibetans do, that if they're in the presence of a great Rinpoche or a really fine teacher, is to present often there's an empowerment or different kinds of Tibetan activities. There's a chance for everyone to approach the guru and present often a white scarf. In that moment, sometimes people are bold enough or care enough or devote enough that they want to have the guru, the teacher, bless their mala. So what they'll do is they'll suddenly pull out the mala and they'll present it to the teacher. And teachers almost always respect this. Because in Tibet, the Rinpoches, and the word Rinpoche just means precious one, really are community assets, and they know that, and loved and respected, and they usually do everything that they can to bless and to comfort the people that come to hear the teachings, that are learning the Dharma. So they literally they usually take the mala from you, often go like this with their hands, and typically blow in it, then hand it back to you. And typically what the practitioner does when the mala is handed back to them is takes it, places it on the top of their head for a moment, and takes it down. It's just like placing the teacher and the teachings and the blessing over themselves. Anyway, let's go back to these 10 counters, 10 sets of counters. Each set is 10 counters, at the end of which is either a vajra or a bell, little pendant kind of thing. So that every time we do one round of the mala, which is like 108 beads, which is considered to be 100 because those extra 8 are understood to make up for the ones you screwed up on, the ones that you didn't say properly or didn't whatever. So that after one mala counting, then you would go and take from the set of counter beads, the vajra set, the dorje set, and move one counter down. So gradually, with 10 counters, that would be 1,000 mantras. After 1,000 mantras, then you would go to the other side of counters, the bells, and move it one. So the whole idea is that by using these two sets of counters, you can count 10,000 mantras. And then there's just one other little thing. Usually somewhere in the mala, and I'll see where it is here, because, yeah, is a little wheel-shaped slider. It can go between the beads, and it goes all the way around 108 beads, 10,000 at a time. I mean, every 10,000 mantras you do, you move this one time. So when you're all done, if you moved that wheel-shaped counter all the way through the mala, you would have accumulated about 1 million mantras. And, you know, 1 million's a lot, but not necessarily for a Tibetan. I mean, there are people who do hundreds of millions of mantras in their lifetime. Now, malas are typically carried in the hand. People can carry them around, or they will loop them around their wrist and walk around like that, or they'll hang them around their shoulder, which, see if I can do that, like that, and walk around like that, or they're put in some kind of a little bag. Here's one that is getting old now, and it's really the second one. The first one deteriorated completely, that a friend of mine made. It's a little embroidery, not embroidery, but a brocade bag. Another thing, it's often considered impolite or disrespectful not to keep the mala or any Tibetan sacred item. The idea is to keep it above the waist. The whole area below the waist, which we all know all about that, is considered just not the place for malas or anything else. So that typically a mala could be kept in a little pocket in your vest or something, but maybe not in your pants pocket, although this is not always followed. I think people just do the best they can as far as this is concerned. Now let's talk about how to move the beads when you're counting, because you have to count them one at a time. There are two common ways to move the beads, and it's basically a slow rolling of the beads with your thumb, grabbing it with your thumb and rolling it from left to right. And actually the bead rolls a little bit. So you're turning the beads, and you're also, by that act, lubricating the beads with some of the oil from your skin, which is considered really good for the beads. If there's no lubrication, the beads dry out, and it's not so good. So with each roll of the bead, each new bead, you let it drop down, and you go and reach for the next one. So that's the most common method. Another method is to use the left forefinger to kind of reach ahead, grab the next bead, deliver it to the thumb, which then rolls it in the same way, so that you're grabbing a bead, kind of picking a bead and passing it to the thumb, and the thumb is rolling it from left to right, from right to left, and then dropping it down on the strings. So at least, I'm sure there's many other ways, but those are the two ways that I've been taught or I've seen done. Malas can be of all kinds, and they can be very, very simple, or they can be very fancy and ornate. It's considered not so cool to flaunt your mala with like gold and silver, just the fanciest of fancy. However, it seems to be kind of done. I mean, that a really beautiful mala, everyone is aware of it. And the beads that make up the mala can be of all kinds. Well, not all kinds, but there's basic types, which we're going to go over here. But typically they're made out of seeds or wood or shell, like pearl or mother of pearl or abalone or whatever. Also, some more rarely of some kind of precious stones or even metal, like silver or gold or amber. And then finally, there are malas that are all bone, often animal bone, but sometimes human bone. But these are seldom ever used by just people like us. They're used by lamas for specific reasons. We'll talk about that. To some degree, what your mala, the kind of mala you have, whether it's seed mala or whatever, determines how it should be used, what kind of practices or mantras should be said on that mala. But this is totally ignored. If someone has a favorite mala, if they're given a mala by their teacher, they use that mala, no matter what it's made out of. And yeah, and as I think I mentioned before, having your mala blessed by someone that you totally respect and that teaches you the Dharma is considered really wonderful. And we all seek to do that without being totally obnoxious about it. And anyway, I pointed out that the whole purpose of a mala is to recite and keep count of mantras. And we talked about they can be made of different kinds of substances, and there are basically 4 types of activities that mantras are used for in Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, I'm sure there may be more, but the 4 main, what I call the main karmas, or the main enlightened activities, are pacifying, enriching, magnetizing, and destroying. And I want to go over that just briefly so that you know what kind of mala you might want to be looking for. For pacifying, for appeasing, calming, for those kind of mantras like the traditional Om Mani Padme Hum, something like that, beads should be white, light, or clear. Could be crystal or pearl, although pearl lose their luster if you make a mala of them, but mother pearl doesn't. Or made out of perhaps a white lotus seed, or polished shell or conch. And long ago they made them out of ivory, but really that's not something we should do anymore. Now for enriching practices, that means to increase, to gather. The beads should be bodhi seed or lotus seed, and there's light and dark lotus seeds. Or amber is really good for that. And sometimes you could see gold, silver, bronze, or copper used in a mala, but I've hardly ever seen that myself. The third kind is for magnetizing practices. Magnetizing means to try to attract or draw power into yourself. The beads can be typically red coral or sandalwood or carnelian, which is another red, sometimes saffron-colored wood. And finally, for wrathful practices, for destructive, forceful, destroying practices, the beads can be made of rudraksha seeds, sometimes iron, lead, and particularly bone, animal, and quite often human bone. One thing I should say about rudraksha seeds, you see them a lot, and the Hindus are really into them, but the Buddhists don't use them. They don't use them except for these destructive practices. So you'll see a beautiful rudraksha seed mala, but if you show it to your teacher, he'll just shake his head and say, that's not, you shouldn't be using that. It's not like it's wrong. It's just like there's some bad juju there, which I don't totally understand, that it's just not cool, so you don't. And lastly, it's not really a class, but for healing and health, and particularly for medicine Buddha practice, typically malas made of lapis lazuli, the deep blue malas are used. And for Vajra Yogini practice, the bright red carnelian. Now let me just say something about mala strings. Malas are never strung on a single piece of cord or string. Instead, they're strung on cords or strands that are woven together. I mean, most strings are more than one strand anyway, but typically you want threads or strands of 3 strands, 5 strands, or 9 strands. And they represent, the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, or the 5 dhyana Buddhas, or the 9 yanas. One other thing, below the guru bead is usually a tassel. Now that's made by cutting many short pieces of silk or tassel thread, folding it in half over the cord of the cord that you use to put the mala together with, and then binding that. You can see from the illustration here. And that's kind of the finishing touch on it. And then below the guru bead is usually a slider bead that tightens the string, and there can be up to 3 of those. Although usually I've seen just one, and the mala I use has just a single one of those. Now let's talk about recitation, actually saying the mantras. The way they're taught is to say the mantras, clearly, distinctly, at some speed that you can manage, but not to mumble them, not to blur it together. However, having been to like scores and scores and scores of empowerments and stuff, the Tibetans say them really fast. And maybe the benefit of that is to accumulate more recitations. But as I mentioned, having spent years around Tibetans, all I can say is that they say them so fast that it amounts to my ears, like a hum or a drone, like some kind of distant engine. And if I didn't know what mantra they were doing from the practice, I wouldn't know what mantra they were doing. I mean, you can't hear. I hear nothing distinct at all. It's more like a. I can do that, but then I'm not clearly pronouncing the mantra. So I've kind of given up on being Tibetan, and I just do my very best to say clearly and distinctly, softly. And Tibetans don't recite mantras in a monotone. They definitely have cycles. It goes up and down. And I don't really want to imitate it, but it's something like so it goes up and down, and they suddenly you hear them pronouncing something kind of you almost can get, and then it's back into just sorry to do that to you, but I'm just trying to tell you about it if you haven't experienced it. So it gets silent, then it erupts again, and this goes on. Sometimes you can say mantras as part of an empowerment for a long period of time, half an hour, an hour. Now, another thing, most mantras are not said in Tibetan. In fact, I don't know of any mantras that are said in Tibetan, but rather they're said in Sanskrit, although it's kind of a Tibetanized form of Sanskrit. Now, the reason for this, I'm told, is that these mantras came from India, from ancient Sanskrit, most of them or all of them, and it's thought that part of their power may still be wrapped or is wrapped in the Sanskrit language, and that if we were to translate them into Tibetan, something would be lost in translation. The Tibetans don't want this. They want the power, the potency of the mantra to remain ever strong. Something similar, for the same reason that in all the years I've practiced Tibetan Buddhism, I've had to do all of my practices in Tibetan, or was told to anyway. Sometimes I'm not so good at that, rather than English, because, again, the Tibetans are worried about losing something in translation. Now, an example or a good example of Tibetan Sanskrit, the most famous mantra is the Om Mani Padme Hum mantra for the Bodhisattva Chenrezig, or Avalokiteshvara, which represents kindness and compassion. Now, the Tibetans pronounce it Om Mani Padme Hum, but the real Sanskrit is something like Om Mani Padme Hum. So somewhere over the years, it's kind of just drifted into a Tibetan, maybe it's like a slang or dialect. And there has been actual discussion of reforming the Tibetanized Sanskrit back to the original Sanskrit, and I heard this myself from His Eminence Jamgon Khantrul Rinpoche before his untimely death. He was planning on doing that, but as far as I know, nothing has changed yet. So we learned Tibetanized Sanskrit mantras, and those are the ones that we say. Another point is that saying mantras is very much like doing basic shamatha, calming meditation practice. Only here the mantras are the object of the practice, of the focus. So instead of focusing on the breath or pebble or something like that, you're focusing on resting the mind in the sound of the mantra. And it works really well. I mean, these are all different ways of clarifying the mind. Tibetans often perform public empowerments. You know, everyone can't go to them. Really, you have to have gone through a little Tibetan ceremony called refuge in order to go to an empowerment. Refuge is mostly just recognizing that the Buddha, his teaching, and his followers are something worthy of respect. But anyway, the empowerments all have like a mantra toward the end of them. And you're given that mantra, and you're empowered to actually use it or recite it. It's traditional, if you really get serious about that practice, to recite the mantra that you're given a certain number of times. And one of the ways this is done is to recite 100,000 mantras for each syllable in the mantra. So Om Mani Padme Hum mantra would be 6 syllables, so you would be reciting the mantra 600,000 times, and then you would have been said to complete the requirements of mastering that mantra. Although Tibetans also point out that trying to number something is only approximate and say, well, if you've done this many, it's really the soul and spirit and essence of the practice that determines whether you've mastered the mantra or the practice or not. But remember, there are some mantras that are 100 syllables long, so that would be like 1,000,000 mantras or so. Okay, I've tried to give you just a rough idea, and I hope it's been beneficial. And again, my disclaimer, I don't know that much about it. I just know something about it. And if you want to be having mullahs and using mullahs, then it's good to know a little bit about how to use them. So I hope this has been helpful.